I'm going to be going over how to set up a virtual router within Proxmox. There are many operating systems that are designed to be used on routers on little PCs like this. Some examples include pfSense and Untangle. And these often work well on these small PCs that have dual network ports, so one could be used as a WAN port and one could be used as a LAN port. And these PCs are small physically, they're low power, they're generally pretty reliable, and work well as a little router box if you want a more advanced solution than what a normal home router can give you. And they could do many more features than a traditional home router with lots of fancy routing abilities, the ability to do multiple subnets, ability to do like VPNs and traffic filtering on the device as well. But you can't just do that on devices like this. You can also run it within a virtual machine on a hypervisor like Proxmox. And I'm going to be going over kind of the network setup that you want to do to make that work correctly. Some of the advantages of doing this within a virtual machine include the ability to easily make backups and restore previous backups of a router in case a configuration change doesn't work. The ability to be easily able to switch between operating systems on your virtual router without having to have really any playing with hardware or hardware downtime. You could easily move it between nodes if you have multiple high availability nodes in your setup. The ability to give it more resources as needed, and the fact that you just have fewer hardware. This also makes it really nice if you want to play around with router setups. So if you maybe want to set up like a virtual multiple routers or a little virtual VPN setup just to play with, or maybe just trying to try having one router and a few VMs to see how it works for you without having to touch any real hardware. But setting up a virtual router also has some disadvantages. The biggest one for home users, I'd say, is the dependency chain of your router just gets a lot higher. Whereas a normal little Untangle box or something like this is pretty easy. You make sure it boots and then it works as a router. The virtual machines, you have to make sure a virtual machine starts up. You have to make sure it can access its storage. And there's just a lot more things that have to be working to get a virtual router working that a physical router wouldn't need. In this video, I'm going to be going over how to set up a virtual router using virtual switches within Proxmox. But there's other ways to do it, including using PCIe pass-through to pass through a whole network card to your VM. To make this make a bit more sense, I'm going to set this all up physically first so you can get a better idea of what's going on under the hood so you understand a little bit more of what's happening when I set it up in Proxmox in a little bit. So to represent kind of devices within Proxmox, these two Mac Minis are going to represent virtual machines. These two are switches, which is just the basic switch within Proxmox. This little Raspberry Pi is going to represent the Proxmox host, as the host needs its own connection to do things like updates, make the web management page, or do network storage. And this guy is going to represent my virtual router virtual machine. So there's going to be a virtual machine that acts as a router. And then I have a pile of cables to get everything set up. So now I'm going to first do the setup that happens during the Proxmox installation. So the Proxmox host is created. So now it can connect over the network to another system. And it creates a virtual switch. We're going to say this guy right here. And by default, everything connects to your first virtual switch. And that virtual switch works basically exactly like this guy. And it's a layer 2 switch, which in simplest terms means it gets packet in and it passes it to the other port that has the device that wants that packet. So if I take a virtual machine that I've just created, I can plug that guy in with a network cable and plug it into this little virtual switch I've created. And by default, this virtual switch is also connected to the physical network port on your Proxmox system. So now I've essentially made a three-way switch. One port, which I don't have here, connects to the physical port on your Proxmox host. One port goes to the host system on the Proxmox, so this is kind of the management page. And one port goes to your virtual machine. So now everyone here can go talk to each other and move data, and the switch is going to facilitate that data moving. Now let's say I want to set up another virtual machine. I can plug another cable into my Proxmox virtual switch it's created and plug it into my second virtual machine. And I can keep doing this as much as I want. And all of these virtual machines can talk to each other. They can all talk to the Proxmox host, and they can all talk to the outside world via the physical network port on that system. But if I want to set up a virtual router, the first thing I want to do is create another switch. Proxmox lets you make as many of these switches as you want within it. So by default, it'll essentially just make a switch. It has ports that kind of aren't connected to anything, and it's just sitting there. And if I want, I can assign it another physical port on the system. And if you want to do a virtual Proxmox system, you're going to want 2 physical ports to set it up well, I'd say. You could do it with VLANs if you really want to. So then one of those physical ports is going to go to this little guy here and be what I'm going to call my WAN system. So now this guy might be connected to a modem or some other network connection, or maybe your ISP router box that you have to use. So then it's connected to the external WAN port on my Proxmox system, and I'm going to make a cable that connects it to the WAN port on my virtual router. So now, if my modem can talk directly to this virtual router. Now, one thing I'm going to go over is a lot of home ISPs and networks say your modem should never connect to a switch between it and the router, which is generally true, but if you only connect one device to a switch like this, it pretty much just works like a cable, because there's nowhere else the packets can go, and it only uses one IP address. And now my virtual router needs to be connected to the rest of the devices on the network. And the way I can do that is I can take the LAN port on my virtual router and plug it into my LAN switch. So now let's go over how packets would move around in this setup I have here. This setup works like a basic home network setup where everyone on the network can talk to each other over a switch at the speed of the switch, which in Proxmox is almost unlimited or essentially CPU limited. And then they can go through the router if they want to talk to anyone outside of that local network. Now let's go over how to set it up within Proxmox and how this same wiring can all be done virtually within a Proxmox. Now that I've gone over what's happening under the hood with a little bit of diagrams of these systems to try to understand a little bit more what's happening, I'm going to actually go and make it work in Proxmox right now on this system. So a little bit about my test configuration here I have first. So I have my test Proxmox server here, and I have this system which is kind of representing my local network. These two systems are connected via network switch, and I'm calling this my LAN network. I'm then going to use kind of my main home network I have here as my WAN network. And as long as the router can connect to it and make a NAT connection and set up NAT, it'll work fine if it's under another network connection. Though generally it's best to have it as close to the modem as possible, so that would mean either directly connected to the modem or ISP connection, or plugged into a ISP router modem combo and have it set to forward all the ports. But for testing or use, you can just have it so it's connected as any other device on the network if you wanted to set up and manage your own little subnet. On my screen right now, I have the Proxmox interface for the network interfaces that I have on the system for my host. This is the default that I get after installing it, and it has the IP that I've set the system to and the single port that I've used. By default, Proxmox just uses one port. But if I look at my system here, I actually have 5 ports that I can use. And one of them is going to be my WAN port, and I need to find out which one it is. One way I can find out is by just kind of looking at the device name. Typically, if it's like one number off, it's the same card but the second NIC. So on this system, I have a dual gigabit onboard NIC and a dual 10 gigabit NIC and an IMPI NIC. So probably the single one's the single IMPI NIC. The one I'm using and the other one that's similar to the two EMP ones are the dual onboard gigabit. And these two ENSF somethings are the 10 gigabit fiber optic card I have in here. The way I can also check that seems to work reasonably reliably is go in a terminal, fire up what IP80DR is to see if they're up or down, so it should say right here, and then the command IP link set up ENS like 6F0. So I'm going to run that command now. And it just ran, it's not going to return any response, but if I ran IP80DR now and look at ENS6F0, it still says it's down. But if I go to a port that has a cable connected to it, which is my actual one that's connected to my WAN network, so ENP6S0, it's going to still run with no response, but if I look at it now, it's going to say that connection is up. So now I know that ENP6S0 is the one I've plugged in now. This can be a bit confusing and sometimes require a little bit of trial and error to get it working correctly. But this is the one I want. So now I'm going to go create Linux Bridge. The Linux Bridge is basically the same as one of these switches. It's a layer 2 switch. It's relatively dumb. And I'm going to set it up. So here's its name. I'm going to leave it as VMBR1 right now just so it's simple. I could call it maybe something that's a little bit more identifying. So we're going to just call it like WAN1. Or maybe we'll call it VWAN1. That's trying to make it a virtual one. You can give it an IP address. You probably do not want to do this for a WAN network, as if you're connected to the modem or something, that means your Proxmox host gets an IP, and a lot of modems don't want you to take multiple IPs. In this case, it would be one for the Proxmox host and one for the virtual router, and you can't really do that. The other thing is, that would connect your Proxmox system to the internet directly. And you likely do not want to do that because of security concerns, and you want all your connections to go through your virtual router first, and have it so the Proxmox service connected internally to its LAN network. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm not going to give it an IP address. It still can access the internet via the virtual one, and these switches do not need to have their own internal IP addresses on the host. Bridge ports is what other ports on the system it's going to be connected to. So in this case, that's the ENP6S0 port that I found out was the one earlier. And for name, I have to set it to VMBR and then some number. So it's going to be VMBR1 right now. I can't set it to another fancy name if I'd like. Under advanced, that's MTU if you're going to set that, but I'm going to leave it default here because I'm just using that on all my other systems. So I'm going to go over create right now, and what it says happening is it's going to edit this etc network interfaces file in Debian, and I'm going to hit apply configuration, and it's going to change it, and it's going to restart the networking. If you've done everything correctly, you can still access this web interface here, and if you reload it, it'll work fine. Sometimes if you make a mistake, you'll break your web interface. If it's a new install, you might want to reinstall it if you really broke it, but otherwise, that etc networking interface is where you want to look, because that's where it is in Debian and what happens. So now that I've created the two virtual switches, I need to create a virtual machine that will act as the router. So let's go into create VM. It's going to make it the next one. I'm going to just call it like Untangle1. For this example, I'm going to be using Untangle, but pfSense and almost all the other ones will be working about the same way. I'm going to click Start at Boot. Since it's a router, I want my router to start at boot so it can access the internet. And I make it so when it comes up, the whole thing just starts working. Under OS, I'm going to pick that image I uploaded earlier, so it's this Untangle 16.5 I have here. I'm going to go into System, that all looks fine. Disks, 32 gig disk is generally fine for it. Maybe we'll give it the VirtIO block for slightly better performance. Since it's a Linux router OS, VirtIO block should work fine. CPU, we'll give it a couple cores for fun. Giving it the host is normally the best way to do it for performance if you're not in a cluster. Memory, 2 gigs RAM should be fine. And networking, by default, it only lets you set one networking device. So we're just going to let it sit here, and we're going to add that a little bit later. So now I'm going to go under confirm and finish. So since I could only create one networking device when creating the VM, I have this VM that's going to be created in the config. I'm going to go under the hardware settings, and I'm going to say add a new network device. And it's going to be on that VMBR1 right now. And I need to now figure a way to identify it. One way I've done this in the past is actually use different types of NICs as you can tell them apart, but I don't want to do that for the best performance. So I'm just going to say they're both VirtIO NICs, and you can normally guess and check running in the system. So let's get that VM firing up and installing right now. So you have to install the OS like any other OS, and I normally have some sort of semi-graphical interface to install it. That is pretty much pressing next quite a few times. So it looks like the setup wizard cannot connect to the internet. So I'm going to actually run that setup utility later and run it locally on this system. So I'm going to run that setup wizard, agree to the licensing terms. I'm going to just set up a basic password to configure this guy with. Install type, we're going to say it's a home here. And then network cards. This is where we can take a look at it. So what's happening here is I see the two network cards, and I can see the status on both is connected, but it doesn't really know what's happening. So now I'm going to try to figure out what's going on. And one way I can do that is I know that my VMBR1, which is the second NIC right here, is my WAN, and it ends in 47 with the MAC address. So it looks like these are reversed. So just to double check, my external one ends in 47 on the MAC address, this guy right here, and it's going to be my external, and my internal, Ethernet 0, ends in 14 on the MAC address, number 14, bridge 0, which is my LAN. So that's what I want. So now I should be able to connect to the internet with. And look here, I have an IP address right now. This setup should normally work because these switches just pass packets between it. If you don't have DHCP on your side, you have to set up a static IP here, just like you would if you had a physical system. Now let's take a look at the internal network. So for internal network settings, this is my LAN system. So I'm going to be using the 192.168.2.1. This has to be a different subnet than your WAN one, just because you don't want to have the same subnet. So I'm going to set it up here with that address, and I'm going to make it my DHCP server. I'm going to say it can automatically install updates if I want. I'm going to go to the dashboard on this system. So now it says it's ready to be configured. I'm going to set up that account later, and we can take a look at this guy here. So taking a look at like the networking, under config and then network, that's set up. If I want to see things like hosts on the system, devices, I'm likely going to start seeing devices on the network. So now my little system right here has access to the internet, so I can open any of the web pages that I want. It's pretty much a working Untangle system, and you can have it doing whatever you want. So I have like my systems here. If I want multiple systems, for example, I can have like my virtual machine that I want to have connected. In order to get a virtual machine connected, just make sure that it's connected to the correct virtual network device. So in this case, that's going to be VMBR0. One little hint I'd have is try making 0 whatever the default one is, your LAN, so then you don't accidentally connect anything to your WAN network, because it's easy to just click next, next, next through the installer. Now I set up my Ubuntu VM right now. It has network access, and here's the speeds it gets. That's a little bit more like I was liking, and what happens when I give my speed test a little bit faster of a CPU. Now that I've demonstrated it definitely works, one thing to be aware of with virtual routers is because this system that I'm adminning it all from is currently set to DHCP, if it wants to admin the Proxmox system or the Untangle system, it has to be able to connect to it via DHCP address that it can't get if it's not working. So I probably have a system set to static IPs or just know a static IP that'll work that you can set to your system if you have to troubleshoot in case your DHCP server is down. Now I'm going to demonstrate some features of running a virtual router that I find is very convenient and actually kind of cool that you can't do with a physical router. So first thing is going to be snapshots. So let's say I want to play with changing some network feature and just see how it goes. I can go say take a snapshot and I'm going to include the name of like, let's say, pre-upgrade. So now I'm going to do this one before my upgrade, and since it's before my upgrade, I can take a snapshot, update my virtual router, and then once I do it, it'll either be working, or if there's an issue with the upgrade, I can go back to its config right there, and if I want to restore it to it, it's super fast. I can roll back in like a couple minutes normally. Now I've uploaded a pfSense ISO to my system, and I'm going to install pfSense. I'm doing the clone right now because what I want is I want to have the exact same hardware so all the network cards work well. So I'm going to go onto CD DVD drive, and I'm going to go edit, and I'm going to change it from my Untangle installer to my pfSense installer. And I also need to turn off the Untangle one because having two routers running at the same time is a great way to have very annoying network issues. So now I've started it up, I'm going to select my DVD drive as my boot one, and it looks like, well, there it goes, it's starting to load right now. So now pfSense has finished booting, and I'm in this little menu right here that pfSense has to configure a few things outside of the web interface. So the only thing I really want to do in here right now is set the interface IP address because I'm getting the same IP on my WAN and LAN network. Seeing that it found a DHCP address in my WAN network means that's all connected correctly. So I'm going to just set my LAN network on my LAN setting, which is static, and I'm going to set it to 192.168.2.1. So there's no upstream gateway, so it's not going to be using IPv6, and I want to enable the DHCP server on there, so we're going to do like 192.168.2.34, and the end, this will be like 192.168.2.143. This is the DHCP server range. I'm just setting something random essentially right now, but that should work fine. So now it's going to be reloading the DHCP server and the web server configurator, and now I have a new address. So I'm going to punch that into my browser right now, and let's see what we get. So now I'm going to be getting into the pfSense webpage just to take a look around. Let's sign in with the default of admin and pfSense, and it's going to give me a little bit as it goes to the setup GUI. Yeah, you want me to buy more stuff? We can just leaving this all as default right now just to kind of set it up quickly as a demo. For my WAN interface, it's going to be DHCP. My LAN interface, I've already set that up. Looks like I'm going to keep that password, and it's going to be now reloading all the settings. Let's see if anything changes on here. No, it doesn't, and looks like we're going to finish. So this should bring me to let me see kind of whatever's happening in my pfSense box. So now I have pfSense working, I can access the internet on this system and has full network access, and there really isn't any issues on here. So if I want to go to like Google or something, boom, there it goes. No problems with that. And it's super easy to switch between them now, as I can just go into my setup window for Proxmox, reload this, and change which virtual router I'm using. And that's most of what setting up a virtual router in Proxmox is. A VM that has access to the virtual switches. Hopefully this guide helped you set up a virtual router in Proxmox or showed you some things about Proxmox you haven't used before. And thanks for watching my little tutorial on videos like this.